Thank you, Jonas. And you're also going to mute them in terms of video, right? Okay.
Yes.
Well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. Welcome to another Zoom presentation sponsored by the Foggy Bottom West End Village. I'm Jackie Lemire, member of the Village Program Committee. Today, I have the pleasure of introducing you to Bob Rodweller, who will discuss a very of the moment topic, that is the Electoral College, its history, how it works, and the impacts on the United States presidential election processes. Bob was a professional technologist for more than 30 years and retired from the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. A former Maryland resident, he and his wife moved to Arkansas in 2012, and he has taught classes at the University of Arkansas since 2013. I'm sure you will find Bob's discussion of the Electoral College much interest. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Bob, and thank you for joining us. Bob, it's all yours.
All right, thank you, Jackie. Jonas, thank you, and Susan Haight for asking me to do this, and all the residents who signed up to hear me talk about the Electoral College and why it's important to our government, and it's a critical component of our federal Republican form of government. I've taken basically a semester's worth of information and reduced it into about an hour's talk. And hopefully at the end of this session, you'll have gained some new insights about the Electoral College and why it was developed and its use today. Now let's begin by looking at some of the components of the Electoral College. Basically, you could divide the presidential election process into 3 categories, or you could take and create 4 categories. For the sake of brevity, I've taken the primary process and included conventions. In a class, I would put another box here and call that conventions and go through that. But for the sake of this talk and time, its primary process is general election in the Electoral College. The process of selecting the president was analyzed and discussed extensively throughout the Constitutional Convention of 1787. The pros and cons of each proposal were extensively debated. It wasn't until the last hours of that convention that the design of the Electoral College system was finally agreed upon. You see, the electoral system created by the founders was designed not to be affected by political rancor, mob rule, partisan politics, or influenced by money. It was supposed to be a gentleman's way of working together. That's what they thought. I've heard that, I've read that several times in some of the historical documents. It's a gentleman's way of doing business. So it's very, very collegial kind of a process, you might say. Having said that, let's look at the original intent and some of the language in the Constitution. Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the Constitution states, each state shall appoint in such a manner as the legislature thereof may direct. You see, originally the state legislatures appointed electors, and each state has 2 senators and a number of representatives based upon population and determined by apportionment. Now I'll talk about apportionment in a later slide. I'll show you the models and we'll go through that briefly. But we could spend probably a whole week on that, but I'll talk about that in a later slide. What were some of the options the founders considered for electing a president? There were basically 6 options for selecting a president. Selecting by Congress, by state governors, selection by the state legislature, just taking their process, the original process, tweaking it, adding to it, changing it, and making it better. Or a group of electors. Another one was direct citizen election or popular vote. And lastly, a combination of those options, or one could use the term hybrid. Now, these were the options. Now, not only options, but the founders also had to consider their concerns. And there were major concerns. Concerns such as, if Congress voted for the president might do everything Congress wanted them to do, undermining our system of checks and balances between our 3 branches of government. Another concern would be, what if the states voted for the president? The president might be indebted to the states. This would undermine federalism. Now, federalism is one of the most important and innovative concepts in the United States Constitution, even though that term federalism never appears in the Constitution. Federalism is the sharing of power between the states and national government. In America, the states existed first, and they struggled mightily to create a national government. This led to problems with the Articles of Confederation because they were in such a hurry. That was written in 1777. However, those problems were corrected at the Constitutional Convention 10 years later in 1787. Now, for the general population, these issues were thoroughly written about in the Federalist Papers. If you want to read about that, you can just grab a Federalist Papers and read about it, which many political scholars and theorists believe to be the United States one of the greatest, I guess it would be the greatest political classic in the history of the United States. They're hard to read, difficult to read, but if you do take the time, you gain a lot of information from the Federalist Papers. Another concern that the founders had: the average citizen would not have enough information about candidates in all states. Then each citizen would only vote for the candidate they knew from their state or region of the country. Think back, in the 1700s, the United States was an agrarian society with many farms and small shops that made tools, clothing, built ships, made jewelry, munitions, provided material for state and local governments, as well as the federal government. So communications and information about candidates was slow and hard to come by in those days. Therefore, most citizens didn't have enough information about candidates outside their region to make an informed decision. That's the key. I'll show you a slide in a minute or two about what the country looked like back then, and you can really see how hard it would be for citizens to be informed about others outside of their states. And having said states, another concern was states with large populations would dominate smaller states. Some believed slaves should not be counted in the first census, because if they were, the southern states would have larger populations than southern states. Our country back then was composed of 13 large and small states. Think about this, up and down the East Coast, large and small states, each jealous of each other and suspicious of any national government because of their experience of living in England and its territories, like Scotland and Ireland. There were less than 4 million people in the country who were barely connected by a transportation system, let alone any communications. The founders believed that political parties were mischievous at best and downright evil moving forward. And this is really important. It goes again with this whole gentleman concept. They felt that a gentleman, see, they use the word gentleman, should not campaign for a public office. Rather, that office should seek the man, and that the man should not seek the office. But after long hours of arguing and debating, the delegates came to an important compromise: how to resolve all these issues. Well, one of those compromises was the 3/5 compromise. After numerous debates on the issue and with no agreement, a compromise was proposed. It started off with Virginia. They started off with proposals at the Constitutional Convention. This is what propelled this whole process. It was the 3/5 compromise established that 3/5 of the total population of slave states in each state would be counted for the distribution of taxes and the number of representatives. Not that each slave was considered 3/5 of a person. What they did is they took the total population of slaves in the state and divided it by 5. 2/3 of that went away, and they kept the 2/3 and put that into the population, considered that with the total population of the state. But what's really interesting about this, the slave-holding states wanted slaves to be counted as part of the total population, along with others for census purposes. My way of thinking, they wanted that so they could have a higher number of seats in the House of Representatives. But let's look at, and I talked about this earlier, let's look at this map from 1789 and see how those early 13 states looked. Oh, the other reason, before we get to that state, I put this up there, this diagram, because I couldn't imagine being sequestered for over a month in secrecy in Philadelphia in the hot months in the summer. And they were arguing, debating, and I thought somebody just threw their hands up and said, let's put it up on the wall and these other issues along with this. And this is what they were doodling this out, and this is how they came up with. I just drew that up, put it on the slide, but anyway, that's the way I thought they would probably do it. And here's a map of the slave and free states in 1789. You can see the red or orange states, the slave states. What's interesting, everyone thought that, the Mason-Dixon line above Maryland was, was free states, but you see New York, New Jersey, Delaware also, as well as some parts of Maryland they held slaves. But you can also see that this slide reinforces the fact that there were 13 large and small states, each jealous of each other. Look at the differences in sizes. There's very little and only basic transportation up and down the seaboard, and very slow or non-existent communications if there ever was any. Think about trying to send a letter back then. Had to go through, it was carried on horseback. It wasn't, I don't think we had a postal system back then. The states having larger populations than the southern states had much larger populations than the northern states. You see the size of it. Now, these were the original states. Now, they're not that way now because they were cut up and made smaller so the other states could come about. States with large populations would dominate smaller states. Clearly, they had many more resources than some of these other states. A lot of this was manufacturing, this was agricultural. But they did develop a solution for the election of the president. The Committee of 11 on Postponed Matters of the Constitutional Convention created the Electoral College as a compromise, as I mentioned. Now you're wondering what the Committee of Postponed Matters. Remember, I mentioned that all these issues that they debated and argued about, that they couldn't come to an agreement and resolve or postpone to the end. This group actually addressed all those and came up with those resolutions. It wasn't until the last of many plans adopted during the Constitutional Convention of '87 in Philadelphia. It was one of the last ones. But our form of government was originally designed to work without political parties and what the founders considered factions. They thought political parties were, again, mischievous. Also, the original plan was for the most knowledgeable individual in each state or the district, congressional district in each state, to be selected as an elector, and then select a president based upon, or recommend a president based upon merit and without regard to what the state they were in or where they were from. So having said that, what is the Electoral College? The Electoral College is a constitutional compromise to elect a president of the United States, a group of informed individuals, electors in each state who elect a president and vice president. The founders wanted that group of electors who knew qualified individuals throughout the colonies. And again, they would be from their district and their congressional district and work in that area. They would know others like themselves up and down the coast. They were looking for another George Washington, a John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, or any one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence who had the skills, the abilities, and the temperament to be president. Now, let's consider how the Electoral College has its roots in history. This is very interesting. This is a very important part. The similarities between the United States and electoral college and historical institutions is not and are not accidental. Many of the founders were well educated in ancient history and its lessons. The Electoral College is very similar to how the Roman Catholic Church selects a pope through the College of Cardinals. Now, having said that, I'd like to add a little bit of history. James Wilson from Pennsylvania was one of the most prominent founders. This is what a lot of political theorists believe. Now, in my opinion, I believe James Wilson, was probably the most prominent, the most progressive, the most forward-thinking of the founders. Wilson was a well-known attorney who later served on the U.S. Supreme Court. He was born and raised and educated in Scotland. You see, and he also talked about in England, voters chose members to the British House of Commons directly during that period of time, and then through the history. But in Scotland, they employed a system of indirect election, where local councils chose electors called commissioners, who voted for representatives to Parliament. The way Wilson framed it, he said, to the Scottish way of thinking, this was a form of election by the people. At the same time, he knew many of the in Maryland and what Maryland was doing to select state senators. So at the same time, Maryland was using an indirect election to select those senators. So, and he presented this to the founders, and many of the founders admired the Maryland system. And this was input and used in the design of the Electoral College. So you see, this is just two little aspects of it. There was a lot more from history and the great empires and the great countries throughout the history that the founders drew upon. These are just two small, closely related examples. There are many more. There are three reasons why we have an electoral college. Let's look at the three. The framers of the Constitution feared direct democracy. Now, we'll get back to that in a minute, but that's a direct quote. They feared direct democracy. While at the same time, Hamilton and the other founders feared the average citizen would not have enough information. We talked about that, to make an informed decision. So I put this together in context, but the fear of direct democracy meant to the founders that in times of crises, and this is again based upon their experience, their lessons and education with England and travel and just researching history, that in times of crises, people may panic and too readily sacrifice the fundamental freedoms, while at the same time developing prejudice, hostility, and intolerance, thus allowing governing majorities to disregard the legitimate needs of political, religious, or racial minorities. Now, what I'd like to do is summarize that using a Ben Franklin description. Ben Franklin was a colorful character, and his description of democracy was that democracy was two wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for dinner. Let me just bring that up again. Democracy was two wolves and a lamb voting on what to have for dinner. So you see, this is why they feared direct democracy. They also lived under these conditions in England and studied those direct democracies throughout history. So it's really important to understand the context in which the founders were living and the English influence. Even though the country had separated from England, there were still a lot of people who wanted and looked back to England as the country of choice. And this went on for many, many years well into the 18th century, in the 1800s. So that's one reason. Let's look at the other two. The founders wanted to protect the interests of small states and rural areas. We kind of briefly talked about that. But states such as Rhode Island, Delaware, and rural areas such as Western Massachusetts, Virginia, and Pennsylvania. Number three, the Electoral College helps dilute the effects of votes from densely populated centers whose issues and concerns may be different from the rest of the country. Densely populated centers such as Boston, New York, Philadelphia, Richmond, Virginia, Charleston, South Carolina, and Savannah, Georgia. Now, a question for you to think about, and I'm not looking for an answer, but just to think about and ponder. Are the issues of Washington, D.C. the same as Fayetteville, Arkansas, a university town? We're a big university town, it's a great university town. Or Boise, Idaho, a university town and an agricultural center. Think about that for a bit. So just moving through that, after that question, think about that. What are some of the changes through the years? Well, originally, under the Constitution, the original Constitution, opposing candidates for president and vice president ran on the same ballot. The person with the most votes became president, while the second runner-up became vice president. This could be a Whig and a Democrat. It could be, they could be, let's just say today, it could be a Democrat and a Republican. One could be the president, and the other could be vice president. However, the 12th Amendment, the Constitution, changed that and prevented that problem from ever occurring again. The nation's fourth presidential election, this is very important, was conducted under these new rules. Also, this was the first time candidates actually campaigned against each other. They were getting away from this gentlemanly process. However, this campaigning was very subdued by today's modern standards. And I'd like to make another point about this fourth election, because this presidential election is very important to the history of the United States. Another point about this election that is also very noteworthy is that it greatly intensified political and personal animosity between two men, tragically linked in history forever in our history of the United States. Those being Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr. It got so bad that they went out and they had a duel. As history, tells us, Burr was the survivor that Alexander Hamilton was wounded and died a day and a half later. But again, contrast gentlemanly process to it must have been pretty bad for that to happen. And then today, how the rancor is today, it's amazing how we've come so far. Well, let's look at some of the mechanics of the presidential elections. Presidential elections should be viewed as 51 separate elections. It's somebody sitting there saying, whoa, Bob, wait, what do you mean 51 separate elections? You mean 50 because there's 50 states? Well, I do. There's 50 states plus one to include District of Columbia. There's 49 winner-take-all states. And then there's two congressional district methods, Maine and Nebraska. You see, in 1972, Maine changed its state constitution and all the wording and all the requirements and began the congressional district method of allocating electoral votes. In 1996, Nebraska also changed its state constitution and all the language and began their district method of allocating electoral votes. So you see, we started off with some of that in congressional districts, and I'll talk about why we winner take all later, but in my opinion, this is where the Electoral College should go. It should go back to this because it really gets the votes down to the congressional district, because this is where the voter knows the congressional district. They vote for those people, and it really gets down to where the people have a say-so. That's what I've read, and that's why some of the founders wanted it that way as well. It's just my opinion. That's all I'm going to say about that. But to win, a candidate must get a majority of 538 votes or 270 electoral votes. How does that happen? Here in Arkansas, we have 2 senators and 4 representatives, which means we have 6 electoral votes. California, on the other hand, the most populous state, has 2 senators and 3 representatives, allowing California to have 55 electoral votes. Think about that. 55 electoral votes, the most in the country. Wyoming, the least populous state, has 2 senators and 1 representative. This provides Wyoming with 3 electoral votes. And yes, Washington, D.C. has those 3 electoral votes because of the 23rd Amendment of 1961, which gave D.C. those 3 electoral votes. Now, I'm going to ask another question and let you ponder that. Alaska, Wyoming, Vermont, North Dakota, and South Dakota all have 3 electoral votes. Combined, those 5 states represent 15 electoral votes. A question, again, I'm posing this question for you to think about and ponder. Are California's 55 electoral votes representative of all the needs of those 5 states and their issues? Or and you can say, and, as well as the issues and needs of the rest of the United States. See, do those 55, do they represent the needs of those 5 states or the rest of the United States? And a question, isn't that why candidates have to address the issues and needs of all the states to receive electoral votes instead of going to just specific areas of the country? Just to ponder, just think about that. Now, we talked about apportionment. Well, let's look at apportionment today. This is the Huntington Hill method, and this information comes directly from the Department of Commerce in Suitland, Maryland. Since the beginning of our nation, there have been 4 mathematical methods for apportionment. The first 3 were developed by Thomas Jefferson, Alexander Hamilton, and Daniel Webster. Each were known to have major problems in the mathematical equations, and ultimately they were replaced. It wasn't until the 1940 that a more reliable and 4th method of apportionment was adopted. The Hill-Huntington method was developed by Joseph Hill, a statistician, and Vermilye Huntington, a mathematician. And if you go over to the Department of Commerce in Suitland, I'm sure there's lots of people who would be willing to talk with you about that. They do the census, they do all this type of work over there. So it's a great group. And I don't know how it is with the pandemic, but this is where I got a lot of that information. But why do we have 2 parties in our nation? The drafters of the Constitution did not envision political parties. Remember, it was a gentlemanly kind of concept. As voting and the nation expanded westward, political parties began to emerge. 2 major parties, the Democrats and the Whigs, became firmly established in the 1830s. Whigs became the Republicans in 1856, 4 years before President Lincoln. Now, another little bit of history. I'll just throw this back and forth, and because I find it interesting, because it speaks so much about our nation and the founding and how it's been so successful. The Democratic Party has its roots back to Thomas Jefferson and James Madison. It evolved after the 12th Amendment of 1804, and the modern Democratic Party was formally created in 1828 by supporters of Andrew Jackson. Now, this is so interesting, making it the world's oldest active political party, still operating today. Think about that. It's amazing. It's the single most oldest active political party in the world. I think it's really great. It speaks volumes to our nation. Well, now we've talked about delegates. Let's look at we'll talk about delegates and choosing delegates. Delegates to the national conventions are selected at the state levels, according to state rules and formulas of each party's state committee. Although those rules can change from state to state and from year to year, they get input from the national parties, but mainly it's from the states. Now that we've talked about that, we could take a whole day to separate and talk about that, but let's move on to jump into the primary processes. The United States is a federal republic. A federal republic is a federation of states with a republican form of government. A country that is governed by, now this is my definition, a country that is governed by elected representatives and an elected leader, a president, not a king or a queen or a monarch. I guess it's the same. In a federal republic, there are separate powers between the federal and state governments. This is what we call federalism. We talked about that in one of the early slides. So as we do that, the primary process, how do we award delegates? Well, let's look at that. Democrats use a proportional method. A candidate must win at least 15% of the primary vote in order to receive any delegates. Now, let's look at the Republican. Republicans use the winner-take-all method. But while the Republican National Committee does not require a candidate to win a 15% minimum, individual state parties may require it. Now, back in 2015, in one of my classes, I had a lot of, it was very, we spent a lot of time on superdelegates. We got into this a lot, and superdelegates, what are they, how are they? And so, and also conventions, we got into that a lot. I'm only going to just touch that briefly here. So let's talk about a superdelegate. Superdelegates are unpledged delegates to the Democratic National Convention. They are not required to pledge their support to any presidential candidate and can vote for whomever they please. These delegates include members of the Democratic National Committee, Democrat members of Congress, Democrat governors, or any distinguished Democratic Party leader, including former presidents and vice presidents. Superdelegates are free to support any presidential candidate of their choosing. So that's the brief version of superdelegates. Now, looking at number of delegates, let's look at delegates per state. The number of delegates per state is determined by factors such as the state's population, the number of Republicans or Democrats holding state office, and former state holders. Now, we talked about this whole process of delegates and electoral votes and electors. Before the 1830s, political parties and conventions, candidates were selected in backroom deals during caucuses. Because of this, political parties came about and the selection process became more visible. And this began the process of going away from the district method. This is how it really began right around at this point in time. But let's think about a brokered or a contested convention. This was a big deal. Both parties were talking about this back in 2015 and 2016. Conventions, brokered or contested. So a brokered convention is a presidential convention that fails to nominate a candidate on the first ballot because no candidate gets the votes of more than half of the delegates. On the other hand, a contested convention is more common in the modern era. This refers to the situation in which one candidate has done well, but not well enough to guarantee a first ballot win. Now let's look at, now we've hit the primary process. Now let's look at the general election processes and how they work. During the general election, Americans cast their vote for president. The tally of those votes, the popular vote, does not determine the winner. Instead, those vote totals are used as input to the Electoral College. To win the election, a candidate must receive a majority of electoral votes. In the event a candidate does not receive the majority, the House of Representatives votes for the president and the Senate votes for the vice president. We'll talk about that a little bit more in detail in another slide. Excuse me. So what about those electors? How does it work? You know, do they just get together and run around and share information? But let's see how this process really does work. Let's start with selecting electors. The political parties in each state choose their electors. The parties either nominate their electors at the state party conventions or choose them by a vote at the party's central committee meeting. Now, this is based upon the laws according to each state and based upon the state's constitution, because a lot of this is written in each state constitution. And I'll just say this from in the beginning. Each state has a constitution that's mirrored off the federal government's, the United States Constitution. They took those and put them in each state, would copy that and modify it to each state's needs and issues. So that every state has a constitution like the federal constitution. The number of electors for each state is based upon the number of senators plus number of representatives. All states have a minimum of 3, even the District of Columbia, because we talked about that. And so how do we arrive at that magical number of 270 votes or electoral votes? Well, how do we derive those numbers? Well, let's look at that. How do we come up with 270 or 538? Well, there's 435 US House of Representatives, 100 senators equals 535 electoral votes, plus the 3 electoral votes in Washington, D.C. equals 538 votes. So that's why we have 538 votes. So now you may be saying, whoa, Bob, wait a minute, hold on. Whoa, wait a minute. What about, other places? Well, you may be thinking that may be Puerto Rico. Why doesn't Puerto Rico count in the Electoral College calculations? Because like other US territories, Puerto Rico is a territory and not a state with a constitution. Therein lies the distinction. It cannot participate in presidential general elections and therefore cannot send members to the US Electoral College. It can only participate in the presidential primary processes. It holds a primary election in the spring of each presidential election year in which the parties choose delegates to the Republican and Democratic national conventions. While these delegates do vote for their pledged candidate at their respective convention, this marks the end of the territory's participation in the presidential election process. This is a big question. A lot of it came up in my classes. One of the members from your group also sent me a note about it, and I said I was going to talk about it. But this is the reason. That's the reason why. Let's look some more at electoral votes. If a candidate for president doesn't receive 270 electoral votes, or those 538 divided by 2, 269 plus 1, 270, it's an even split, or a tie would be 269 votes. If that happens, then the House of Representatives is required to immediately go into session and vote for the president. So then you're saying, well, what happens if there's an electoral tie? Well, let's look at that. The House of Representatives then votes in block by state, meaning 1 vote per state. If a state delegation is evenly split, the state is considered as abstaining. They have to drop out. Voting would continue until one candidate receives at least 26 state votes or a majority of the states remaining. And I just said 50 states, 25, half of those plus 1 is 26. But if there were states abstaining, whatever the greater number was, it'd have to have an even split plus 1. So let's look at how if it happened, how the House of Representatives would do that. The House of Representatives has only elected a president on 2 occasions, in 1801 and 1824. In 2000, the Supreme Court made the final decision on George Bush becoming president. The reason that happened is because they couldn't come to an agreement between both parties in the House of Representatives. They had 41 days. It's a time, you got to have that done, because from election day, let's say November 3rd, to the time when the Electoral College meets across the nation, it's 41 days. They had to get done in that time period. So they knew they couldn't do it. They bumped it up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court, I believe, had something like 10 or 11 days. They took all this information from the House of Representatives, had all the staffs working on it, and finally declared George Bush the winner because of the votes that he received. So, but let's go back to those 2 votes in 1801 and 1824. 1824 was also significant for another reason. It was the first election in which the majority of states used a statewide winner-take-all voting method for choosing their presidential electors. Remember, we started talking about that winner-take-all method. And this is how it started to evolve, and this is when it actually happened. Now, the shift to statewide winner-take-all was not done for principled reasons. You think, well, yeah, they did that for principled reasons. Rather, it was a product of political party policies, because state party leaders wanted to maximize their support for their candidates. Once several states made that calculation to go that way, others were required to follow to avoid hurting their side's candidates. So you see, that's how we got there. So who are the electors? Electors can be anyone from a housewife, an attorney, a baseball player, factory worker, or any other career that does not include holding a federal office. Now, there are some restrictions. Let's look at those restrictions. Only restrictions are that no person holding a federal office, either elected or appointed, may become an elector. Electors cannot be a representative or a senator. They cannot be a high-ranking official in a position of trust or profit. Cannot be someone who has engaged in the insurrection or rebellion against the United States. Electors can come from any career that does not include holding federal office or working for the federal government. Now, you're probably asking, what is this position of trust or profit? Well, let me explain that. When I was at the Federal Reserve is not a government agency. It's a central bank of the United States. It's separate from the federal government. So I was in a position of trust. And each year I had to go through the general counsel and complete my forms each year. I had to go through a financial disclosure every 6 months. So that's a trust position. And so I couldn't be an elector, even if I wanted to. And for profit is someone who's, let's say, works for Lockheed Martin or one of the defense contractors, because they're working for profit for the company. So you see, that's the other pieces of that. You couldn't, if you're working for some agency of trust, it's not an agency, but it's associated with the government, it cannot be, or for profit. Companies like, again, you could take some of the big accounting companies. So that's the only restrictions. So again, who are the electors and what are the processes of selecting electors? The process for selecting electors varies throughout the states. Political parties nominate electors at their state party conventions or by vote at the party central committee meeting in each state. Both Democrat and Republican presidential candidates have their own slate of electors as part of the selection process. Here in Arkansas, let's say, or in Maryland, you have a Democrat and Republican candidate. They both have the number of electors based upon the number of electoral votes. Let's say in Arkansas, we have 6 electoral votes. So the Democrat has 6 electoral votes and the Republican has 6 electoral votes and electors, those electors. So they are appointed by their state parties, depends upon who wins the election. Now, how does one become an elector? Well, electors are chosen because of their service to their party. They may be a party official or a person who has held a party position such as a committee chairperson. On election day, the voters in each state choose the electors by casting votes for the presidential candidate of their choice. And so how are the electoral votes allocated? Each state is allocated a number of electors. Again, we talked about based upon the senators and a number of representatives. I said in Arkansas, we have 6, 2 senators and 4 representatives. Therefore, we had 6. But actually, we had 6 Democrats and 6 Republican electors. And we have already, and I'm sure they've been selected now, or they're thinking about selecting them here in Arkansas. So that's how that all works. That's kind of a high level summary of that. Now we're going to get into some real, I think what's really the meaty part of the talk. And I'm going to show you a couple of slides that have a map of the United States and some electoral maps. This is where it really gets into, you start to see hopefully what I've been talking about and in relationship to the United States in total. So let's look at a map of the electoral map of the United States from 2008, just for reference point. I want to make a point of this. This is an electoral map, Electoral College Map from 2008. You see here's the red states and the blue states that voted. And it shows each state's electoral college number or votes per state. Let's pick on Washington State, for example. They have 11 electoral votes. Over here is California, the most populous state, has 55 electoral votes. 55 electoral votes. Far more than any other of the states. But close to that would be Texas with 34, and another one would be Florida with 27. So then that's the electoral map of 2008. So then we go from 2008, let's go to 2012 and see what's changed. You see 11 in Washington State, 34 and 27. We'll just go Washington, Texas, and Florida. Let's look at, so what happened? Washington State has 12 now, it's from 11, from 34 to 38, and from 27 in Florida to 29. What happened in between 2008 and 2012? It was the decennial census. That's been happening since 1700s of 2010. In 2010, census occurred. And based upon that, you see in the northeastern industrial states lost populations, and they lost seats in the House of Representatives. And so a lot of those people were moving out of it. You know, it was the baby boom generation, plus the industries left the United States and closed down. So a lot of those individuals moved to the warmer southern states and over into Washington State. So you see these northern states and central states lost. But then you look down here, Louisiana, they went from 9 to 8. So what happened? Why did Louisiana, which is right there in the Gulf, you know, it has right next to Texas, it has great seaports, and, you know, New Orleans and all that. Why did they lose an electoral vote? Well, remember Hurricane Katrina. What happened is they moved all those individuals out from here in this part of the state to Texas and Florida, Alabama, and South Carolina. That's what happened. That's how they lost those seats, or that seat. Those individuals went to those states developed new lives. They're prospering, and they haven't come back. They haven't come back to that state yet. So you see that's going to happen. And based upon what I'm reading, what I'm hearing, that this trend is going to continue, that we're going to see a lot of the northern states lose more population. So what's going to be interesting for me is to see the results of the 2020, this decennial census, the 2020 decennial census. What happens, who loses seats and who gains seats, because it's going to remake the electoral map. I think is going to be very interesting. Now, in the next slide, I'm going to show you a map of the United States. I tried to get one from Department of Commerce, and this is the best I could at the time because the lines could have been better. But anyway, it still makes the point. This map shows the 144 largest counties in the United States, as well as the almost 3,000 smallest counties. You can see the state lines, and if it was a little bit better, you'd see the counties. But what it makes the point, if we go back, you see some of the states where the large populations are, and those electoral votes, they're in the same areas. You see where the electoral votes are. So you see, this is the largest counties. And going back to some of the reasons of what the founders wanted to do, they wanted to protect those large populous states over the smaller populous states and try to even out their influence. So that's why they came up with the Electoral College. You see, because if it was the other way around, these areas would vote and the rest of the country wouldn't have to vote. So I think that's pretty clear on that one. Now, having said that, and I'm not making it's not a political statement, it's the reality of the fact. But I have another one that I was able to get from a friend of mine down at Suitland, is let's look at the 2016 presidential election results by county. You see there's blues here, and reds, and pinks, light blues across the nation. So you see again how that shakes out, or that's again what the founders were trying to do. I think this drives another point home. You can see again, heavily populated areas. So let's do a recap. How does it all work? Let's tie it all together and recap it. Step one, each political party chooses a slate of electors prior to the general election. These electors are pledged to vote for a party ticket. Electors are chosen by their political parties in each state. In 2016, Arkansas, for example, had 6 electors pledged for Clinton and 6 electors pledged for Trump. So let's move on. Step 2. In November of the presidential election, each year, the state holds a general election. Citizens vote for a ticket for president and vice president. Results from that general election dictate which electors vote in the Electoral College in December. All electors are expected to cast their votes for the candidates that win a state vote. The winner-take-all system. If the Republican wins the vote in Arkansas, their slate of electors would cast their votes for the Republican candidate. But if the Democrat won, their electors would cast their vote for their Democrat presidential candidate. So let's look at the electors. The presidential electors meet in the respective state capitals. We've been talking about that. They come together in their state capitals in December. That's their meeting. 41 days, remember I talked about that, 41 days after the general election. The winning electors cast their electoral votes for their candidate. The Electoral College never meets as a national body, and this was established to avoid collusion and cheating by the founders. That was very important to them. Step 3, in January, Congress assembles, opens the ballots from each state, records and sums the totals, and announces the official outcome. The current vice president is in charge of counting those votes. It's amazing because I think back when this was in 2000, Vice President Al Gore was counting those votes. It had to be hard on him, and I shouldn't say that, it's my commentary. But anyway, step 3, let's move on to another. States may or may not require electors to vote with the popular majority. 26 states have legal requirements in their state constitution that electors have to vote with their parties. Now, if you look, District of Columbia is not a state, but they have legal requirements that says that their electors have to vote with their popular majority. We moved from Maryland because Maryland had legal requirements. You look at some of the other eastern states, they had those. So if we have 26 states with legal requirements, then there's 24 that don't. Let's look at those. 24 states have no legal requirements requiring their electors to cast their vote for a specific candidate. So when we moved to Arkansas, I thought, well, let's look at some of the processes. Well, guess what? They don't have it. They don't have any legal requirements. It's pretty interesting. Neither does Texas, Utah, West Virginia, New Hampshire, Missouri. Look at these states. So what happens in step 3? What happens if an elector casts their votes for someone other than whom they're pledged to elect? They're called faithless electors. Well, since the beginning of our nation, and I've updated this to include 2016, on 115 occasions, electors voted for a candidate different from whom they were pledged. Now, 71 of those were changed due to the death of the elector prior to voting. Now, that could have been from, in today's, automobile accident, they might have been hit by a car or truck, or was out in the ocean, was bit by a shark, I don't know. Back in the in the beginning of the nation, it could have fallen off a horse or died in fields or from heart attacks. So any of those reasons. 2 of those votes were not cast when electors abstained from voting for a candidate. 85 electors changed their votes because of personal interest or a mistake. Now, I think there have been mistakes, but they're probably few and far between. Somebody might have saw John Kerry versus John Edwards and made a mistake and just checked the wrong box. That's legitimate, but I think the majority of these were at personal interests. A faithless elector runs a greater risk of party censure than legal requirements. And what I mean by that, party censure is much greater than, let's say, a $20 or $40 legal fine. It could be a $150 fine. If a political party takes action on a person who doesn't, go with the flow of that political party, that person is basically persona non grata, not only in that state and that party, but other states, and their political, aspirations are finished at that point in time. So we could go through a lot of this, and I could talk about some really interesting faithless electors who've done this, but I'm going to run out of time, but we can talk about it later as well. But let's review the upcoming presidential election because we're getting a little over time. So now let's do a summary, and let's look at all this related to today's, this November election. On November 3rd will be election day. That election day happens. Mid-November through December 19th, 2020, governors prepare 7 certificates of ascertainment, sends one of those certificates to NARA, or National Archives and Records Administration. 6 certificates are held for the meeting of electors in December. On December 13th, states resolve any controversy with electors because they want to make sure by this time it's done. But I have to tell you, they do this almost immediately. If an elector says they're not voting for, I'm not voting for X or I'm not voting for Y, and as soon as they open and they present that and it gets out, the state party takes immediate action. I don't care what state it is, they take immediate action to ensure that those votes are valid. They want to make sure their votes are valid. And then on December 19th, 2020, the electors sign, seal, and certify 6 sets of electoral votes. The certificates are distributed to the President of the Senate. 2 packages are sent to the Secretary of State in each state. 2 packets are sent to the archivist of National Archives and Records Administration. The archivist is the chief records keeper of the United States. Then, on December 28th, electoral votes must be received by the President of the Senate and the archivist. On or before January 3rd, 2021, the archivist meets with the Secretary of the Senate and the Clerk of the House in late December or early January. This is really basically a ceremonial process because informal meetings have already taken place throughout that process from the general election on. They're working with them. They know they're trying to avoid any conflict, and they're trying to make sure the dates happen. And they meet all the required dates and everything's accounted for. Then on January 6th, 2021, the Congress meets in joint session, counts electoral votes, and formally declares the president. January 20th, 2021 at noon, Inauguration Day. The president-elect takes the oath of office and becomes president of the United States. And so that is basically, I've tried to compress maybe a semester and a half into an hour, and I've gone over an hour. But I really appreciate sitting and thank you, and hope that you have a better appreciation for the Electoral College and why it's important to our representative form of government and why it's a critical component of electing a president. So now I'd like to turn the meeting back over to Jackie. And thanks again, I really appreciate it. And I've turned my slides over. I've sent those to Jonas with an article, a little pamphlet I wrote back in 2015 about this. So if anyone wants those, you can just request them from Jonas and he'll send them to
you. Jackie, you're muted, but thank you very much. I think that was very informative. I certainly learned a lot moving forward too. Lots to look out for in this busy election season. But I wanted to say thank you very much. It has gone a little bit over time. If people want to stay and ask some questions, you're welcome to do that. I can also, I'm sure, pass them on via email if you're okay with that, because we are a few minutes over. And if people want to drift away, that's okay. But if Bob's okay with it, we can save for a couple questions, quick questions.
Okay.
May I ask one, please? This is Lorna. I found that fascinating, and I'm curious about 2 things. Who actually establishes the qualifications for electors, and are the dates for the meeting of the college adjustable, considering that there might be delays in getting a total count this year?
That's a great question. I think they're written as part of that. They're in the articles, and I think in the public register. In 41 days, that's why back in 2000, that Supreme Court, they were rushed to get in within that 41-day time frame. And I think today, it's no matter how it shakes out, they have to fit within those time frames. So I think it's pretty much, you're going to have to form fit our election within the process.
Anyone else?
Ruth, can you hear me?
Yes.
Where does the so-called opportunity for manipulation come up?
Say that again. I'm sorry.
Where are the opportunities, unquote, for manipulation of results of the Electoral College votes? In other words, this vice president, for example, counts it. How do we know he or she counts them correctly?
Well, there's a whole committee there. He's just a figurehead. they've already been counted by the time they get to the
Oh, good.
vice president. So
Where are the other places where it could go awry?
it couldn't. The only place it would go is in each state, and each state is required, the government of each state is required to look over that. They have overseers. It's like when you go to a voting poll, you have vote checkers, you have people who are they're counting those electoral votes several times. They also have to sign. I was going to include in one of my, in my last class, I actually had the letters of assignment, had the signatures by each elector, and they signed off basically for penalty. In the state of Arkansas, they will go to jail if they cheated. And, they have not only the electors, but they had both parties overseeing the whole process down in Little Rock. It's really, you should watch it.
It's really honest.
You should watch it.
What about the superdelegates?
Well, that's at the convention. That's not
okay.
relating to
All right.
your electoral college.
All right,
That's a party conventions, and that's how that operates.
I'm off. I'm sorry.
That's okay. It's all
I
right.
think Burke raised her hand, and then maybe one more question after this, and we'll go. And you're muted.
I didn't quite understand what you thought was the main argument for maintaining it today. I saw how we got to here. I thought what I heard you say was, well, California doesn't understand Arkansas.
I didn't say that.
But what do you think is the main argument for maintaining it today then?
What I asked a question, and I asked you to think about, were those 55 votes of California, do they address those electoral votes? Will they address the needs? They're going to address the needs and concerns of California and what the California is going through. Will those electoral votes and those needs and issues, are they the same in Fayetteville, Arkansas, and Washington, D.C.? That's what I said.
No, but it works in reverse too. So what do you think? I don't still grasp what is the main argument for maintaining this today?
Well, I gave you 5. There's, large states versus small states, large population centers versus small population centers, needs and issues of each state, and the populations of each state. And I also showed you basically the dynamics of the changes in the density of each state and where they're moving to. So you see that.
Well, I can certainly see why small states wouldn't want to change it, and why I can see why all the people who are advantaged by it wouldn't want to change it. But in the abstract, what is the argument against one person, one vote?
Well, I think, okay, what you're asking about right there is direct democracy. That's what you're asking about. And I gave plenty of examples that the founders wrote about and talked
But
about.
back then, I mean, but today, you think those arguments still apply today?
You're asking me my personal opinion. Well, let's put it this way. Let me see if I can answer that without giving you my personal
I'm looking for a good argument, whether it's your personal opinion or not. I don't see the case for maintaining it.
Okay, well, what if you lived in, I don't know. How about Wyoming? If you lived in Wyoming.
Yeah, I'm from northern Minnesota.
Okay.
I understand that one. And I understand why northern Minnesota would want to be ruled by New York, but New York doesn't want to be ruled by northern Minnesota.
Okay, I am gonna, not to cut it off, but just for the YouTube purposes and the post purposes to not stray too far away from the lecture.
Yeah, I was just asking.
You're also more than welcome to put it in writing, and I can send it off, and then you guys can have.
And I think I could provide an answer, but
Yeah.
I just think that the founders made great use of their talents in developing a way of electing a president, and they memorialized a lot of that in the Federalist Papers. And I think a lot, and again, I believe a lot of that still applies today. But again, it's personal opinion. If you're from Nebraska and you live in Washington, D.C., maybe you have the same things. But I think I tried to present it, both cases for, and why it was founded, why we have it.